All right, finally, the final episode. You know what? Just before we get started here, a quick shout out to all my students throughout the years who have expressed some appreciation or just enjoyed my class. You guys make my job a pretty awesome part of my life. And I just decided to do this because I know some of you, a pretty small number, but I know some of you will really watch all of these and actually enjoy them and learn from them. So this is for you guys. Anyways, we get into 1780 and 1781. These are the final, busiest, and most complicated years of the entire American Revolution. All the significant fighting here is going to take place down in the South. Remember, that's where the British are focused after we wiped out the British Northern Army under Burgoyne at Saratoga back in 1777. Now, Washington's army is still up there where you see that blue star outside New York City. So, American forces down in the South are actually based in Charleston, South Carolina, and that's the next target for the British Army where you see that purple arrow. The Brits have arrived outside that key port city at the end of March with over 8,000 men. And after about 45 days of siege, we are forced to surrender the most valuable port city in the state. Not only do we lose Charleston, but over 5,000 Americans are captured by the British. It's the most devastating loss of men for us during the entire American Revolution. Now we are left without really any army down in the South, any sizable army. This is basically our Saratoga, an entire army removed from the game board. And now, with Charleston under British control, General Clinton is going to return back to what we've been calling Army Group Center up in New York City. And he's going to leave Charles Cornwallis in charge of about 10,000 men down in South Carolina with orders to take over North Carolina and Virginia. Now, we're going to go ahead and label Cornwallis's force as Britain's Army Group South. So hold on to his name, Cornwallis, Southern Army, big role here in this episode. Um, Now, the bad news for Cornwallis is that the population of South Carolina does not show up to come join the Brits in large numbers like they had expected. But the bad news for us is that we're about to suffer another humiliating defeat in the South. In May, is that right? Yeah, in May 1780, after Charleston fell to the British, Congress sent Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, down there to lead a new but smaller American army in the South. And in August 1780, Gates' men arrived outside Camden, South Carolina, where they ran into Cornwallis and about 2,000 British soldiers. Now, Gates had twice that number. There were twice the number of Americans that day, but Gates made all the wrong calls, a series of errors that led to half of his men being killed, wounded, or captured. The Battle of Camden is probably for us the most embarrassing and mismanaged battle of the entire war. And again, we're left without any real victory or sign of success in the South. And still, we don't quit. I mean, these Americans just don't seem to understand when you're supposed to surrender. The British have taken New York City, Philadelphia, Savannah, Charleston. They just beat us again. And we haven't had anything like the success of Saratoga in like 3 years now. That means that we should admit defeat. That's just how wars usually go. But like Vietnam or Britain in World War II or Ukraine in 2022, we just don't quit. I mean, if you look at this map, by 1780, the British really only control what you see in red, just the areas around some major cities and a few loyalist strongholds. By by that year, about like 90% of the land is completely outside the control of the British army. They are winning the battles, but they never really approach anything like complete victory over us. Our army always slips away to fight another day. That's kind of the whole point of that Fabian strategy, right? By 1780, we are now in the fifth year of the revolution. And as you can see on the right, Britain's national debt has been skyrocketing as the war has gone on. In September 1780, after we got crushed at Camden, where you see that big five, Cornwallis crossed into North Carolina and captured the key city of Charlotte. But just then, things started to turn in our favor. If you look at the dotted blue line in the top left, you're going to see the path of several small patriot militias racing towards the area. These over the mountain men targeted a large loyalist militia in the area, leading to the Battle of Kings Mountain. With about 1,000 men on each side, this is the largest all militia battle of the entire revolution. And in just over an hour, the Patriots killed the loyalist leader and put an end to this pro British militia in this area. The British had to abandon their plan to invade North Carolina, and the Americans finally won a significant victory after a series of defeats. Now let's look over at the 1781 map. This shows us the first 4 months of the year. Our new commander of the Southern forces, Nathaniel Greene, who's really the guy Washington wanted down in the South the whole time. Nathaniel Greene has divided his soldiers, sending about 2,000 men west of Camden. In the middle of the map there, where you see that very short dotted white line. In January 1781, American forces absolutely dominated the Battle of Cowpens, killing, wounding, or capturing over 80% of the 1,100 British soldiers in the fight. That was roughly a quarter of their force in the area. And even better, the defeated British here were commanded by Bannister Tarleton, whose men had murdered Americans after they surrendered at the Battle of Waxhaws. Oh man, do we despise this guy. So the defeat of the hated Tarleton at Cowpens felt great. It lifted the morale of the entire American army at this time. And even though no one knew it at the time, this was the second real turning point of the war. For after Cowpens, the entire British army in the South was unknowingly on the path to their final defeat. Now let's check out that solid blue and long white arrows. These are the main American and British armies in the area. The British, led by Cornwallis, are chasing the Americans, led by Nathaniel Greene, up into the North Carolina, hoping to trap them and defeat them. But Greene manages to escape across the Dan River into Virginia, where he quickly builds up and rearms his force. In February, he crosses back across the river into North Carolina, leading over 4,000 well-supplied and ready-to-go men. Now Cornwallis is the prey because he's become overdrawn as he's chased us all the way across North Carolina. On the Ides of March 1781, Cornwallis ordered an attack on Greene's position at Guilford Courthouse, where you see the number 6. The British made a larger group of Americans actually retreat here, but they lost 25% of their 2,000 men on the battlefield. Look at the bottom left for the stats. Now, back on the map where you see number 7, that's the path of the British Army after they had to leave the area after the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Way off to the right there, where you see that arrow, you see Cornwallis's main force marching out of the Carolinas and giving up on their plan to take over the states. Greene continued to lead his men deep into the South along the path of that black and orange arrow you see there, resulting in another fight with the British at the Battle of Camden in April. Or, sorry, not the Battle of Camden, but at Camden in April, where you see the number 8. This is actually the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, and the British lost another 250 dead and wounded out of the 900 men they had in the fight, making them surrender Camden to us and then head back down to Charleston along that faint dotted line you see leading south. Now, I know it's a lot of complicated movements, right? But it ends in April with the British abandoning their invasion of the Carolinas and returning to their bases on the coast. Here you can see the two maps side by side if you want to pause and evaluate. I'm going to admit here, I spent way too much time explaining the step by step here down in the South. Hopefully some of you found those details enjoyable. I mean, this is what your textbook gives you for comparison. So there you go. If that's the only thing you ever saw, good luck figuring that out. In April, as Cornwallis and the British Southern Army abandoned the Carolinas, this is when the French Army and Navy arrive in full force. Thousands of French soldiers arrive, and French commanders, whose names I'm simply going to shorten as Lafayette and Rochambeau, command even more men than Greene down in the South. I mean, the French are bringing thousands of dudes with them. The British Navy stretched all across their worldwide empire, and dealing with the new European League of Armed Neutrality simply doesn't have enough ships to send over to this area to deal with what France has just sent. Now, that black and orange line shows the path of Army, who eventually march all the way down to Charleston and begin to besiege the city until the very end of the war. That green arrow that you're looking at, though, shows the path of Cornwallis's army as they leave and gave up on the Carolinas. Even though the British fought well there, they had lost over 2,000 men in what was supposed to be an easy conquest down in the south. For a couple of reasons now, the British are going to gather their southern army in Virginia at a place called Yorktown, where you see that big green dot. And no one knows it yet, but the coming Battle of Yorktown will be the final battle of the war. So the British Southern Army under Cornwallis is gathering in Yorktown. A large British army holds New York City, but it hasn't really done anything in years. The thing is, Washington has always believed that the war is going to be decided in some sort of final battle over New York City. That's why he stayed up there since 1778. American forces now being led by von Steuben and Lafayette are uniting in Richmond, Virginia. And when word arrives that a massive French fleet of battleships is arriving soon, there seems to be an opportunity to surround the British base at Yorktown and repeat the success of Saratoga. It took some pretty serious convincing, but eventually Washington listened to the advice of his subordinates and agreed to march his army south to join Rochambeau and Lafayette, surrounding the British at Yorktown. But he can't let the British know he's leaving New York. So, in August 1781, to keep General Clinton and the main British army there in New York City, Washington sends out all these fake messages to trick the British into expecting an attack on the city. But in reality, he's secretly moving with the French army over 450 miles in 3 weeks through southern heat across the path that you see there to Yorktown. The British didn't really realize what Washington was doing by heading in that direction. And by the time they did, it was too late. Now, to draw your attention to the number 5 there, take just a second to find number 5 on these maps. On September 5th, as Washington and the French led a combined force of over 7,000 men towards Yorktown, the French Navy won the Battle of Chesapeake Bay, which is going to play a major, decisive role in our coming victory. The British Navy was damaged badly enough at this battle that they had to leave the area, and that meant that the British Army in Yorktown was going to be totally surrounded. So this is it, folks. The battle that leads to Britain's final surrender and their eventual recognition of American independence. This is really more of like a 3-week siege of Yorktown, not really a pitched battle. It's not 3 weeks of just nonstop, intense World War I style combat. It's really more of that classic maneuvering and digging of trenches and redoubts while shelling enemy positions with artillery gradually. From our perspective, it's about taking 1 yard at a time. And from the British perspective, it's about preventing our advance. So on October 14th, after 2.5 weeks of siege, the American position is so close that we are able to launch attacks on 2 British redoubts outside Yorktown. Cornwallis, now knowing that his position is too weak to defend with the French Navy off the coast, makes an attempt to escape across the James River, but it's blocked by bad weather. So this is the checkmate moment. Cornwallis and his 7,000 remaining men are totally surrounded and forced to accept surrender. Even more men are going to be surrendering here at Yorktown than did at Saratoga. So a second British army has now been captured, and 3 years of the Southern strategy for the British has ended in failure. On October 19th, the British army had to march out of Yorktown in defeat. They had to walk past the French and American armies in defeat as the American band mockingly played Yankee Doodle Dandy. Can I get a Go America? Sorry, British, we still love you today. Now, General Clinton could, if he wanted to, try to keep this war going. I mean, they still control a large army in New York City, Quebec, Charleston, and Savannah. The British could have sent more ships and more soldiers in 1782, just like they did after losing an army back in 1777. Old King George sure wanted to, but by this time it had become politically and financially impossible to continue the war. This would have meant completely restarting from scratch, basically, something the British Parliament and the public was just not willing to do at this point. Back in Britain, as this war is dragged on and the debt has piled up and young British men are being killed and wounded every month, the number of people in the public and the parliament back there who opposed the war has gradually increased. And after the Battle of Yorktown, support for the war just wasn't sustainable. It's not like the British have been totally annihilated and defeated. It's just that support is no longer sustainable. They're not going to start over from scratch and retake all that purple land and turn us back into colonies. That project has got to be abandoned now. Parliament rejected the option of extending the war with a new campaign. And so now their only real option is to acknowledge that the 13 states are indeed an independent country, forever outside the control of the British Empire. And that's how our nation was born, folks. That's how a ragtag rabble in arms won their freedom from the most powerful empire on the planet. Huh? Huh? Go America? Anyway, now, as all of us history nerds know, the war did not truly end, and the British did not officially recognize our independence on paper for another 2 years after some extremely complicated negotiations over in Europe following the Battle of Yorktown. You can look at the right hand side of the timeline and see the gap between Yorktown and the official Treaty of Paris that ends the war. We're not going to get into that period here. This series is really focused on the Revolutionary War, and for all intents and purposes, the war is over. I mean, in truth, there are some tiny little battles after Yorktown, but none of these are like organized attempts to change anything. They're just, engagements in it and encounters that happen while the negotiations are playing out in Europe. Now, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war nearly 2 years after the British surrendered at Yorktown. The American colonies are now officially a free country, and the treaty recognized that our territory now extended all the way to the Mississippi River, at least as far as the British and the Europeans were concerned. So if you look at the two colors behind the American flag here, that's the United States on the map. Now, of course, this map acknowledges the fact that the land is already home to multiple native tribes, and plenty more on that as we move deeper into American history. But this map shows the United States as it officially exists, according to the rest of the world, according to the Treaty of Paris. George Washington might have become king here. But like the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was given dictatorship of Rome but abandoned his power to return home to his farm, Washington abandoned all military and political power, returning to his home. At some time in the future, he's going to be called out of retirement, but that's not for another 8 years. He's not going to be called out of retirement to become president for another 8 years after Yorktown. So, at the time, some people called him the modern Cincinnatus. It's quite fashionable today to focus on the fact that Washington was a slave owner. And sadly, he most certainly was. But there are other aspects of his life and his actions that are admirable. You can accentuate the admirable or the shameful in your own interpretation of history. Everybody does. But just, try to make an attempt to acknowledge the balance on the other side. Whatever you're focused on, just acknowledge the other side does exist. That we're not going to go down that road right now. You know what? Anyway, a bit off track there. Sorry. We're going to begin our famous experiment in democracy. And this whole question of can people govern themselves is not the most controversial question that you can ask today. But thousands of years of history across many cultures had given us monarchy and oligarchy, theocracy, aristocracy, and all sorts of you have no say systems of government. But this modern democratic experiment truly was a revolutionary notion. The experiment did not end all inequality. That wasn't even the goal of what we were doing here. But it put the planet on the path in that direction. It created the myths and the models that we inspire to. The ideas that all men are created equal and that no one was born with the right to rule, and that the government should be limited and should serve the people instead of the people serving the government. Those ideas slowly but surely did remake the world as Thomas Paine had promised. So, to wrap it all up, the struggle that began at Lexington and Concord in 1775 was finally over. Hopefully, you have a greater understanding and appreciation for what it took to secure this country's freedom. Hopefully, now when you look at this timeline, it actually makes sense to you. If you can explain what's happening in these arrows and these boxes here, then you definitely understand the path and the events of the American Revolution. Maybe, hopefully, you'll want to read more about these events or check out some other YouTube videos or documentaries or movies, or like I've suggested, read real history by real historians. Even if you just go down a series of internet rabbit holes and slowly make history, like one of your things, I will be very, very happy. Anyway, apologies for any inaccuracies in the series. I'm sure there are probably quite a few that stand out, but like I said, I'm not a historian, and you get what you pay for, right? You get what you pay for. Hopefully, you've got something to think about each 4th of July, a little gratitude mixed in with all the celebration, and hopefully, at the very least, I can get a Go America. Go America.